The summer sun beat down relentlessly upon the steep slopes of Witkov Hill, just outside the ancient city walls of Prague in July of 1420. Thousands of heavily armored knights, serving the Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund, waited impatiently for the signal to charge up the ridge. They looked up at the crude wooden fortifications that lined the crest of the hill with a mixture of contempt and anticipation. Inside the makeshift walls, a small group of peasant warriors stood ready with flails and primitive hand cannons. They were vastly outnumbered and lacked the formal military training of their noble enemies. The air was thick with the smell of black powder and the nervous sweat of men who knew they were the last line of defense for their capital city. At stake was not merely the control of a city, but the survival of a religious revolution that threatened the absolute power of the Catholic Church. If Prague fell, the rebellion would be crushed under the iron boot of the Crusade, and the cries for reform would be silenced by fire and sword. The entire kingdom of Bohemia stood on a precipice between spiritual independence and total annihilation. Emperor Sigismund viewed these rebels as heretics who deserved nothing less than extermination. He had gathered the might of Europe to purge this infection from his lands. The defenders on the hill understood that surrender was not an option for them. They were fighting for their souls and the memory of their martyred teacher. Commanding this ragtag force of farmers and townsfolk was a man who would soon become a legend in military history. Jan Zizka was a 60-year-old veteran who had lost one eye in battles long past and possessed a mind sharp enough to dismantle the traditions of medieval warfare. He did not look like a typical general of the era, for he wore no gilded armor and rode no high-stepping warhorse. Instead, he stood among his people with a grim determination and a deep understanding of the terrain. Zizka knew that he could not defeat the knights by playing by their rules. He had to invent a new way of fighting that turned the strengths of the chivalric class into fatal weaknesses. The question echoing across the battlefields of Europe was whether a disorganized rabble of peasants could possibly stand against the finest mounted warriors of Christendom. How could agricultural tools and simple wagons hope to stop the charge of heavy cavalry that had dominated warfare for centuries? The monarchs and bishops of the neighboring lands laughed at the absurdity of the Bohemian resistance. They believed that divine right and superior steel would grant them an easy victory over the heretics. But they failed to account for the ingenuity born of desperation. They did not realize that the rules of engagement were about to change forever on the bloody slopes of Bohemia. The answer came with a thunderous roar of early firearms and the clash of iron flails against plate armor. The knights who charged Witkov Hill were thrown back in a chaotic and humiliating defeat that shocked the Western world. This victory was not a fluke, but the result of a brilliant tactical innovation known as the Wagenburg or Wagon Fort. Jan Zizka had transformed farm wagons into mobile fortresses that could stop a cavalry charge dead in its tracks. The Hussite Wars had begun in earnest, and for the next 15 years, the armies of the Pope and the Emperor would break themselves against the iron will of the Bohemian people. To understand this explosion of violence, we must look back to the teachings of a humble priest and scholar named Jan Hus. Years before the first battle was fought, Hus preached in the Bethlehem Chapel in Prague to massive crowds of common people. He spoke against the corruption he saw within the Catholic Church and criticized the sale of indulgences. Hus believed that the Bible should be accessible to everyone in their own language, rather than hidden behind Latin liturgy. His sermons resonated deeply with the Czech people who felt marginalized by the German-dominated clergy. He became a symbol of national identity and spiritual purity in a time of deep cynicism. The popularity of Jan Hus drew the ire of the church hierarchy, who viewed his calls for reform as a dangerous threat to their authority. In 1414, he was summoned to the Council of Constance to explain his views under a promise of safe conduct from Emperor Sigismund. Hus traveled to the council hoping to engage in a theological debate and clear his name of heresy. However, upon his arrival, he was arrested and thrown into a dungeon. The promise of safety was ignored by the council fathers, who declared that one did not need to keep promises made to heretics. For months he languished in prison while his trial proceeded without him. On July 6, 1415, Jan Hus was led to the stake outside the city walls of Constance after refusing to recant his beliefs. As the flames rose around him, he sang hymns until the smoke choked his voice and ended his life. His execution was intended to terrify his followers into submission, but it had the exact opposite effect. When news of his death reached Bohemia, the entire nation erupted in fury and grief. The Czech nobles sent a letter of protest to the council, with hundreds of seals attached. The common people began to view the Pope and the Emperor as the true enemies of God. The unrest in Bohemia simmered for 4 years as the followers of Hus began to organize and demand religious freedom. They called themselves Hussites and adopted the chalice as their symbol representing their demand to receive both bread and wine during communion. The Catholic Church had previously reserved the wine only for the priesthood, which the Hussites saw as a violation of Scripture. Tensions rose in Prague as radical priests whipped the crowds into a frenzy. The weak King Wenceslaus IV tried to navigate between the angry populace and the demands of the Church, but he lost control of the situation. The spark that finally ignited the powder keg occurred on a Sunday morning in July of 1419. A radical priest named Jan Zizka led a procession of Hussites through the streets of Prague to the new town hall. They demanded the release of several Hussite prisoners who had been arrested by the town council. When the councilors refused and someone threw a stone at the priest from a window, the crowd stormed the building. They seized the judge and several councilors and threw them out of the high windows onto the spears and pikes of the mob below. This event became known as the First Defenestration of Prague, and it marked the point of no return for the rebellion. King Wenceslaus was so shocked by the news of the violence that he suffered a stroke and died shortly after. His death left the throne of Bohemia open to his half-brother, Sigismund, the very man who had betrayed Jan Hus at Constance. The Bohemian estates refused to accept Sigismund as their king, and the country plunged into open revolt. The moderate Hussites in Prague tried to negotiate, but the radical factions in the countryside began to prepare for a holy war. In the rural areas of southern Bohemia, thousands of peasants abandoned their homes and gathered on hilltops to await the second coming of Christ. They founded a new fortified city, which they named Tabor after the biblical Mount Tabor. In this city, they attempted to create a society based on absolute equality and communal living. Private property was abolished, and everyone addressed each other as brother and sister. The Taborites were the most radical wing of the Hussite movement, and they were convinced that they were the warriors of God chosen to cleanse the world of sin. Jan Zizka arrived in Tabor and was immediately recognized as the military leader the movement desperately needed. He saw the potential in the fanatical devotion of the peasants, but he also saw their lack of equipment and training. He began to organize them into a disciplined fighting force that operated with the precision of a machine. Zizka drilled them relentlessly and taught them to obey signals from flags and whistles. He understood that discipline was the only way to counter the individual prowess of the heavy knights they would face. Under his command, the farmers of Tabor became a professional army. The genius of Jan Zizka lay in his ability to adapt agricultural tools for the purposes of war. He took the common farm wagon and reinforced it with thick wooden planks and iron chains. These wagons could be linked together wheel to form a mobile fortification that could be set up anywhere in a matter of minutes. Gaps between the wagons were covered by large shields called paved and manned by crossbowmen and handgunners. This invention neutralized the shock of a cavalry charge and forced the knights to fight on foot against a fortified position. Inside the wagon fort, the Hussite soldiers were assigned specific roles and worked in coordinated teams. Some men were responsible for driving the horses, while others handled the pikes and flails used to hook knights off their mounts. The use of early firearms was integral to the strategy, as the noise and smoke terrified the horses of the enemy. Zizka was one of the first commanders in history to use field artillery as a tactical weapon rather than just for sieges. He mounted small cannons on carts that could be moved quickly to support the infantry where the fighting was thickest. The first major test of these tactics came at the Battle of Sudemer in March of 1420. Zizka and a small force of Hussites were intercepted by a large army of royalist cavalry while moving across the countryside. He positioned his wagons on a dam between two fish ponds, which prevented the knights from flanking him. The royalists were forced to dismount and attack across the muddy ground, where they were bogged down in their heavy armor. The Hussite women reportedly spread their veils on the ground to entangle the spurs of the knights. The royalists were slaughtered and Zizka escaped to Tabor. Following the humiliation at Sudemer, Emperor Sigismund declared the First Crusade against the Hussites. A massive army of knights and mercenaries from all over Europe converged on Prague, intending to starve the city into submission. The capital was divided between the old town, which was held by moderates, and the castle, which was held by royalists. The crucial strategic point was Witkov Hill, which overlooked the supply roads into the city. If Sigismund took the hill, Prague would be cut off from the countryside. Zizka hurried from Tabor with his troops to reinforce the defenders. The victory at Witkov Hill broke the siege and saved the Reformation in its infancy. Sigismund was forced to retreat in disgrace, having been defeated by the very peasants he despised. The Hussites had proven that their God was with them, and their morale soared to new heights. However, the victory did not bring peace to the fractured land. Internal disputes between the radical Taborites and the moderate Utraquists in Prague threatened to tear the movement apart from within. Zizka often found himself acting as a mediator and enforcer to keep the rebellion focused on the external threat. Tragedy struck Jan Zizka during the siege of a castle in 1421 when he was wounded in his remaining good eye. The injury left him completely blind, yet he refused to relinquish his command. For the rest of his life, the blind general led his armies by listening to the descriptions of the terrain provided by his aides. He had the map of Bohemia memorized in his mind and possessed an intuitive sense of timing that no sighted general could match. His soldiers believed he was guided by divine providence, and their loyalty to him was absolute. Under the command of the blind Zizka, the Hussite armies went on the offensive and cleared the royalist garrisons from much of Bohemia. The Emperor Sigismund launched a second crusade in late 1421, hoping to catch the Hussites off guard. His army encircled Zizka at the Battle of Kutna-Hora and believed they had finally trapped the old fox. But Zizka executed a daring night maneuver that defied all military convention. He formed his wagons into a column and charged directly through the enemy lines with all guns blazing. The breakout at Kutna-Hora is considered one of the first examples of mobile artillery usage in history. The sudden barrage of cannon fire in the darkness panicked the Crusader army and allowed the Hussites to escape the encirclement. Zizka then turned his army around and counterattacked the disorganized imperial forces. The Second Crusade collapsed in a rout as the knights fled across the frozen fields. The legend of the invincible blind general grew with every victory, and fear of the Hussites spread throughout the Holy Roman Empire. While the external war raged, a bizarre and violent episode occurred within the radical wing of the movement. A sect known as the Adamites emerged, who believed that they should return to the innocence of the Garden of Eden. They walked naked and engaged in rituals that the other Hussites found abhorrent. Zizka viewed them as a distraction and a stain on the purity of the cause. He marched against their stronghold and exterminated the sect without mercy. This action demonstrated that Zizka was a disciplinarian who would tolerate no deviation from his strict moral code. The Hussites briefly sought a foreign protector and offered the crown of Bohemia to the Grand Duke of Lithuania. For a short time, Lithuanian troops fought alongside the Czechs, but political pressure from the Pope and the King of Poland forced them to withdraw. The Bohemians were once again alone against the world. A third crusade was launched, but it dissolved almost as soon as it began due to lack of coordination and the terrifying reputation of the Hussite armies. The Crusaders were becoming increasingly reluctant to face the flails and hand cannons of the heretics. In October of 1424, the great Jan Zizka died not in battle, but from the plague while besieging a castle near the Moravian border. His death was a devastating blow to the movement he had saved so many times. According to legend, he ordered his skin to be made into a drum so that he could continue to lead his troops into battle even after death. His soldiers were so grief-stricken that they began to call themselves the orphans, for they felt they had lost their father. The enemies of Bohemia rejoiced, believing that without Zizka, the rebellion would crumble. But the Hussite military machine was far from finished. A new leader emerged named Prokop the Great, who was a priest as well as a general. Prokop had served under Zizka and understood the Wagon fort tactics perfectly. He was a different kind of leader who shaved his beard and focused more on political strategy, but he was just as effective on the battlefield. Under Prokop, the Hussites shifted from a purely defensive strategy to aggressive raids into neighboring countries. These raids were known as the Beautiful Rides and were intended to force the enemy to the negotiating table. The Fourth Crusade was launched in 1427 and met the same fate as its predecessors. The Crusaders fled at the Battle of Takov before the main Hussite forces even arrived. The psychological impact of the Wagon forts and the thunder of the firearms had created a deep-seated phobia among the German knights. The church leadership was baffled by the continued success of the heretics. They could not understand how God could allow such a rebellion to prosper unless it was a punishment for the sins of the clergy. The culmination of the crusading efforts came in 1431 with the Fifth Crusade. A massive army led by Cardinal Julian Cesarini entered Bohemia with high hopes of finally crushing the revolt. They met the Hussite forces at the Battle of Damascus. As the Crusaders approached, they heard the terrifying sound of thousands of Hussite soldiers singing the hymn "Ye who are warriors of God." The strange and ominous sound rolling over the hills caused a panic to spread through the Crusader ranks. The entire army broke and ran without striking a single blow. The victory at Damascus was the turning point that forced the Catholic Church to change its strategy. They realized that the Hussites could not be defeated by force of arms. The Council of Basel invited the Bohemian leaders to negotiate a peace treaty. This was a momentous occasion, as it was the first time the Church had treated heretics as equals rather than criminals. Prokop the Great led the Hussite delegation and debated theology with the cardinals for months. The goal was to find a compromise that would allow the Bohemians to practice their faith within the Church. However, the peace negotiations exacerbated the internal divisions within the Hussite movement. The moderate Utraquists and the nobility were tired of the constant warfare and the economic blockade that was strangling the country. They were willing to compromise with the Church and the Emperor to restore peace and order. The radical Taborites and orphans, on the other hand, refused to accept any authority that did not align with their strict interpretation of the Bible. They viewed compromise as a betrayal of God and prepared to fight their former allies. The conflict between the factions culminated in the fratricidal Battle of Lipany in May of 1434. The moderate coalition of nobles and Utraquists allied with the royalist Catholics to destroy the power of the radicals. They outnumbered the Taborite and Orphan army and possessed their own Wagon forts and generals who knew the tactics well. For the first time, the Wagon fort strategy was used against itself. The battle was long and bloody, but a feigned retreat by the moderates drew the radicals out of their defenses. Once the Taborites left the safety of their wagons, they were cut down by the heavy cavalry of the nobles. Prokop the Great was killed in the fighting, along with the core of the radical leadership. The defeat at Lipany marked the end of the radical phase of the Hussite Wars. The power of the field armies was broken, and the influence of Tabor was permanently diminished. The path was now open for a settlement with Sigismund and the Council of Basel. It was a bitter end for those who had dreamed of a perfect society. Sigismund was finally accepted as King of Bohemia in 1436 after agreeing to the Compacts of Basel. These agreements granted the Bohemians the right to receive communion in both kinds and acknowledged the authority of the Utraquist Church. It was a partial victory that secured the religious freedom of the Czech lands for another 2 centuries. The Pope refused to officially recognize the compacts, but was powerless to stop them. Bohemia became a kingdom with 2 religions coexisting side by side. The Hussite Wars left a profound legacy on the history of Europe and the development of warfare. The tactical innovations of Jan Zizka proved that infantry armed with gunpowder weapons could defeat heavy cavalry. The era of the invincible knight was beginning to fade, and the modern era of gunpowder warfare was dawning. The wagon fort tactic was adopted by armies across Eastern Europe and influenced military thinking for generations. The sheer effectiveness of the Hussite war machine remains a subject of study for military historians to this day. Religiously, the Hussite movement was a precursor to the Protestant Reformation that would sweep Europe a century later. Martin Luther famously declared that we are all Hussites after reading the works of Jan Hus. The defiance of the Bohemian people showed that the authority of the Pope could be challenged and that a national church could survive against the wishes of Rome. The ideas of individual conscience and vernacular scripture that Hus championed became the cornerstones of the Reformation. The story of the Hussite Wars is a testament to the power of conviction and human ingenuity. It is the tale of how a small nation in the heart of Europe stood alone against the might of an empire and a church and refused to break. From the fires of the stake at Constance to the thunder of cannons at Vitkov Hill, the echoes of this conflict still resonate. The blind General Jan Zizka and his peasant warriors proved that faith and innovation could topple the giants of the medieval world, leaving a mark on history that time cannot erase.